Click. The sound of wood snapping under weight cut through the heat like a gunshot no one fired. And in the same breath, the wagon tipped, one wheel lifting helplessly before crashing sideways into the dust as two children were thrown into the road, and the woman followed a second later, not screaming, not begging, just hitting the ground with a quiet that felt heavier than any cry as the horses ahead kept moving, dragging the broken harness forward until it tore free completely, leaving behind a cloud of sunlit dirt that settled slowly over everything like a verdict already made. The men on horseback laughed, not loud, not wild, but certain, the kind of laughter that came from knowing no one would stop them. One of them glancing back just long enough to say something the wind carried away before it reached her ears, something meant to reduce a life to nothing more than an inconvenience on a road that did not belong to them, and yet somehow did. The older child pushed himself up first, hands shaking, eyes searching not for revenge but for his mother, while the younger one stayed where she fell, stunned, blinking against the brightness, her small fingers still curled, as if holding on to something that was no longer there. And the woman, Eleanor Hayes, rose last, slower than the rest, brushing dust from her dress with movements that had no anger in them, no panic either, only a quiet refusal to break in front of those who had already decided she was meant to. She did not call after. The men did not curse them, did not even look their way for more than a heartbeat, because she had learned something about this land that others had not, that sometimes the loudest protest only fed the silence of those who watched and chose not to act. And there were many watching now, figures standing along the edges of the road, near the wooden posts and the dry grass, eyes shifting, hands still, each person carrying their own reason for doing nothing. And then there was one who did not move at all, not because he was afraid, not because he did not see, but because he saw too clearly. Caleb Whitaker sat high in the saddle a short distance away, his horse calm beneath him, dark coat catching the light, his posture relaxed in a way that made him seem removed from the moment even as his eyes remained fixed on it, taking in every detail, the broken wheel, the dust in the children's hair, the way Eleanor placed herself between them and the empty stretch of road, as if something might still come back to finish what had been started. The breeze shifted, carrying the faint scent of leather and heat, and for a moment, time seemed to narrow down to a single line between where he sat and where she stood. But he did nothing, not yet, not when every other man would have either ridden forward in anger or turned away in indifference. He chose a third thing, something harder to understand, harder to judge. He watched, and in that watching there was weight, calculation, something unresolved, as if the moment itself had not finished speaking. Eleanor finally looked up then, not directly at him at first, but at the shape of a man on horseback who had seen everything and chosen. Stillness, and when their eyes met, it lasted only a second, long enough to register presence, not intention, before she turned back to her children, lifting the younger one gently, checking for injury with hands that did not tremble, while the boy tried to right the fallen crate that had spilled its contents into the dust. A few small items scattered, one rolling slowly until it stopped near the edge of the road, unnoticed by them, unnoticed by anyone except the man who had not moved. Caleb shifted slightly in the saddle, not enough to signal action, just enough to mark the moment, and then, without a word, without a glance back at the men who had caused it, he turned his horse and rode away, leaving behind the broken wagon, the quiet woman, and the question that settled heavier than the dust itself. Why would a man who saw everything choose to do nothing at all? The road did not remember kindness, only tracks, and by the time the dust settled, the marks left by the wagon wheels were already fading into the same dry earth that had swallowed 100 stories before this one. Eleanor Hayes knelt beside the broken axle, her hands steady as she tested the damage, would splintered clean through. No quick fix, no easy way forward, while the boy gathered what little had spilled from the crate, a tin cup, a folded cloth, a small bundle wrapped tighter than necessary, as if it held more than its weight suggested. And the younger child clung to her mother's sleeve now, eyes wide but silent, learning something no child should have to learn this early, that the world could shift beneath your feet without warning and no one would come running to set it right. Along the roadside, the onlookers began to drift away one by one, not in a hurry, not in shame, just with the quiet efficiency of people who had seen enough to know how the day would end and preferred not to be part of it. A man adjusted his hat and spat into the dirt. A woman pulled her shawl tighter and turned her back, and within minutes, the place that had held witnesses held only absence, as if nothing had happened worth remembering. Eleanor stood slowly, brushing her palms together, leaving faint streaks across the worn fabric of her dress, her gaze lifting toward the direction the men had gone, but not with anger, not even with hope, just a brief acknowledgement before she turned away, because there were still things to do, children to keep moving, a road to walk even if it no longer welcomed them. She bent to lift what she could carry, leaving the broken wagon behind without ceremony, as though it had never truly belonged to her in the first place. The boy hesitated, looking back at the scattered pieces they could not take, his eyes catching on something small near the edge of the road, half buried in dust where the sunlight struck it just enough to glint. He moved toward it, crouching, brushing it free with careful fingers, revealing a silver badge, smooth at the edges from years of wear, engraved with markings he could not read, but felt important in a way he could not explain. He turned it over once, twice, then looked up at his mother, unsure whether to keep it or leave it like everything else that had been taken from them. Eleanor studied the object for a moment longer than she intended, something in her expression tightening before she softened it again. "We don't take what isn't ours," she said quietly, but her voice lacked the certainty it once carried. The boy nodded, yet did not move to put it back, instead slipping it into the fold of the cloth bundle without another word, as if the decision had already been made somewhere deeper than thought. The sun climbed higher, pressing heat into the backs of their necks as they began to walk, three figures moving along a road that had just rejected them, their shadows stretching thin and uncertain across the ground, and for a while, there was only the sound of footsteps and the occasional rattle of something loose in the bundle, until the silence was broken not by voices, but by the distant echo of hooves again, slower this time, measured, not the reckless speed of men who took what they wanted, but something else, something deliberate. Eleanor did not turn at first, choosing instead to keep her eyes forward, to keep moving as though whatever approach would pass them by like everything else had. But the sound did not fade. It drew closer, steady as a thought that refused to leave, and when it finally stopped, just behind them, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Caleb Whitaker dismounted without a word, boots meeting the dirt with a soft weight that carried more presence than noise. He stood there for a moment, looking at the broken line of their path, the absence where the wagon should have been, the way the children positioned themselves instinctively near their mother, not hiding, not confronting, simply enduring. He reached into his coat then, not for a weapon, not for anything that might escalate what had already been done, but for something folded, something ordinary, yet held with care, and still, he said nothing, not yet, because whatever this moment was becoming, it had not reached its end, and rushing it would only bury the truth that was beginning to surface beneath the dust. The man did not rush his words, and somehow that made the silence heavier. Caleb Whitaker stood just behind them with the kind of stillness that did not ask for attention but commanded it anyway. The folded paper remained in his hand, untouched by wind, untouched by doubt, as if he had carried it longer than the road itself. Eleanor finally turned, slowly, not startled, not defensive, only aware, her eyes meeting his without fear yet without trust. The children shifted closer to her, the boy's hand tightening unconsciously around the cloth bundle where the silver badge rested hidden, a small secret pressing quietly against the weight of everything else they had lost. Caleb looked at them one by one, not measuring, not judging, just seeing, and when he spoke, his voice came low, even, carrying no edge. "That wagon won't hold another mile," he said, not as criticism, not as pity, simply as fact. Eleanor glanced back at the empty stretch behind them where the broken wood lay abandoned, then back to him. "We've walked farther," she answered, her tone steady, as if distance meant less than dignity. Caleb nodded once, a small motion that seemed to acknowledge more than her words. He stepped closer then, careful not to close the space too quickly, and extended the folded paper. Slightly, not offering it yet, just letting it exist between them. "There's a town ahead," he said. "Red Hollow." The name hung in the air like something already decided. Eleanor's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not surprise, not relief, something closer to recognition of a place that did not welcome people like her. "We know it," she replied, and for the first time there was a trace of something beneath her calm. Not fear, but understanding. Caleb's gaze moved briefly toward the horizon, then back. "They'll know you too," he said. And that was all. No explanation, no warning dressed as kindness. Just truth placed gently where it could not be ignored. The boy looked up then, curiosity breaking through caution. "Why are you telling us this?" he asked, his voice small but clear. Caleb did not answer immediately, his eyes dropping for a moment to the ground where their footprints marked the dust. 3 sets, uneven but unbroken, then lifting again. "Because I saw what happened," he said, and something in the way he said it carried weight far beyond the words, as if seeing had created a responsibility he had not yet decided how to carry. Eleanor studied him now with more focus, searching not for intention but for honesty, the kind that did not need to be spoken twice. "A lot of people saw," she said quietly. Caleb's expression did not change, but something behind it did. "Not everyone remembers," he replied, and in that moment, the distance between them shifted, not closer, not farther, just different. The wind picked up slightly, brushing against the edges of his coat, and the folded paper in his hand moved just enough to reveal a corner stamped with an official seal. Not prominent, not meant to impress, but undeniable to anyone who recognized it. The boy's eyes caught it before Eleanor's did, his gaze narrowing with a child's instinct for things that mattered. But he said nothing, holding the knowledge inside like he had the badge. Quietly, Caleb lowered his hand then, still not offering the paper, as if waiting for something unspoken to settle first. "There's water half a mile off the road," he added, nodding slightly toward a line of trees barely visible. "In the distance, safer than walking straight through." Eleanor followed his gaze, weighing the direction, the distance, the unknown, then looked back at him. "And you?" she asked, not accusing, not hopeful, just asking. "Which way are you going?" Caleb held her eyes for a moment longer than before, and when he answered, there was no hesitation. "The same way you are," he said, simple, direct, without promise, without explanation. And yet something about it settled into the air like a decision. Already made, not loud, not dramatic, just present, like a line drawn quietly in the dust that no one had noticed until it was too late to step around. The trees appeared slowly, like something the land had been hiding until it decided they had walked far enough to deserve it. Thin at first, then thicker, casting shadows that broke the harsh line of the sun into something softer, something that made the air feel different, cooler, quieter, as if the world itself was lowering its voice. Eleanor led without looking back, her steps measured, each one chosen with care rather than urgency, while the children followed close, the boy glancing once toward Caleb, not with suspicion anymore, but with the kind of attention given to something not yet understood. And Caleb walked beside them now, not ahead, not behind, keeping a distance that respected more than space, his presence steady, unspoken, like a decision that did not need repeating. The sound of water came before the sight of it, faint at first, then clearer, a soft movement over stone that cut through the dryness of the day, and when they reached it, the younger child let out the smallest breath of relief, not a laugh, not a cry. Just a release she had been holding since the road. Eleanor knelt beside the stream, cupping water in her hands, offering it first to her children, watching them drink before she allowed herself the same. The simple act carrying a weight that had nothing to do with thirst and everything to do with survival. Caleb remained standing for a moment longer, scanning the edges of the trees, the line where shade met light, as if expecting something to emerge from it. But nothing did, only the quiet. Only the slow movement of water and the occasional shift of leaves in the wind. The boy stepped closer to the edge, unwrapping the cloth bundle just enough to check what lay inside. His fingers brushing against the silver badge hidden within, he hesitated, then pulled it free completely, turning it in the filtered light, the engraved markings catching a dull shine that seemed stronger here, cleaner somehow. "I think this belongs to you," he said suddenly, holding it out toward Caleb, his voice carrying a careful honesty. as if returning it might undo something that had already begun. Caleb looked at the badge, then at the boy, and for the first time since the road, something shifted in his expression, not surprise, not recognition exactly, but a quiet acknowledgement of a piece moving back into place. He stepped closer, taking the badge without urgency, his fingers closing around it with familiarity that spoke of long use, long responsibility. "Where did you find it?" he asked, though. The answer was already clear. The boy nodded toward the road behind them. "It fell," he said simply. Eleanor's gaze moved between them, lingering on the badge now in Caleb's hand, the shape of it, the weight of it, something about it pressing against her thoughts in a way she could not yet name. Caleb turned it once, then slipped it back into his coat, the motion practiced, quiet. "You should have kept it," he said, not as reproach, but as statement. The boy frowned slightly. "It is not ours," he replied, echoing his mother's words from earlier. And this time, there was no uncertainty in them. Caleb nodded again, slower now, as if that answer mattered more than the badge itself. "No," he said, "it is not." The stream continued its steady flow, indifferent to what passed beside it. But the moment had changed, something small yet undeniable settling between them. Eleanor rose to her feet, wiping her hands against her dress, her eyes returning to Caleb with a new focus, not trust, not yet, but a question forming more clearly than before. "You are not just passing through," she said. It was not a question. Caleb met her gaze, holding it without hesitation. "No," he answered, just as plainly. And for a second, the silence that followed felt less like distance and more like understanding waiting to be spoken. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a distant echo, not loud, not close, but familiar enough to draw attention. The faint rhythm of hooves somewhere beyond the trees, slower than before, searching, not yet certain. Eleanor heard it too, her posture tightening just slightly, the children turning instinctively toward her, the fragile calm of the stream beginning to thin at its edges. Caleb did not look toward the sound immediately, his eyes remaining on Eleanor, as if giving her the choice to see it first, to decide what it meant. And when she finally turned her head toward the distant rhythm, he followed, his expression unchanged, but his stance shifting almost imperceptibly, not into readiness for violence, but into something quieter, something more deliberate. The kind of readiness that did not rely on force but on timing, on truth, on knowing exactly when the moment would demand to be answered. The sound did not rush toward them. It lingered at the edges of the trees like a question waiting to be answered, slow hoofbeats, careful, searching, not the careless thunder from before, but something more deliberate, more patient, and that made it worse. Eleanor's hand found her daughter's shoulder without looking, drawing her closer in a motion so natural it felt like breath, while the boy stepped back from the stream, his eyes moving between the direction of the sound and Caleb, as if trying to understand which one mattered more. Caleb finally turned his head fully toward the distant rhythm, his gaze narrowing slightly, not in fear, not in anger, but in recognition, as though he had been expecting this exact moment to arrive, just not this soon. The trees held the sound for a while longer, stretching the silence until it felt thin. Then the first shape appeared between the trunks, a rider moving slowly, scanning the ground, followed by another, and another, until three figures emerged into the filtered light, their horses stepping carefully over roots and stones, their presence controlled, not chaotic, which made their intent clearer than any shouted threat. They were not passing through. They were looking for something, or someone. Eleanor did not move, did not step back, did not shield her children further than she already had. She simply stood, her posture straight, her eyes steady, as if she had already decided that running would only confirm what others believed about her, and she would not give them that. Not again. The boy swallowed hard, his fingers tightening at his sides, but he stayed where he was, mirroring his mother in a way he did not yet realize, while the younger child pressed closer, her small hand gripping fabric, her eyes fixed on the approaching riders with a quiet fear she refused to voice. Caleb stepped forward then, just one pace, enough to place himself slightly ahead without making a show of it. His movement subtle, almost easy to miss, but it shifted the shape of the moment, drawing the rider's attention toward him first. The lead rider slowed, his horse stopping a few yards away, his gaze moving from Caleb to Eleanor, then to the children, calculating, measuring, as if fitting them into a story he had already decided was true. Saw a wagon back on the road, he said, his voice flat, not loud, not soft, just certain. Looked like trouble. Caleb did not answer immediately, his eyes holding the man's without challenge, without submission, simply present. Trouble past, he replied after a moment, his tone matching the stillness of the trees around them. The rider's jaw shifted slightly, a hint of impatience breaking through the control. We are not asking about the past, he said. We are looking for who it belongs to. His gaze flicked toward Eleanor again, sharper this time, as if expecting her to step forward, to claim something that would give him reason. But she did not move, did not speak, the silence stretching once more, but now it carried weight, expectation, the kind that pressed against decisions not yet made. Caleb reached into his coat then, slow, deliberate, the same motion as before, but this time there was no hesitation in it, no waiting for the moment to settle. He drew out the folded paper, holding it loosely at his side, not presenting it yet, not announcing it, just letting it exist where it could be seen. The lead rider's eyes dropped to it instinctively, a flicker of something passing through his expression, not recognition yet, but interest, caution beginning to form beneath the surface. Road runs through here. The rider continued, though his voice had shifted slightly, less certain now. We make sure it stays clear. Caleb nodded once, as if agreeing with a fact that did not need arguing. Then you should make sure you understand who it runs for, he said quietly, and the words landed differently than anything that had come before, not loud enough to echo, not sharp enough to provoke, but precise, exact, like something placed carefully on a scale. The wind moved through the trees again, carrying the scent of water and dust together, blending the calm of the stream with the tension of the road. And in that space between, something began to turn, not a fight, not yet, but a shift, a subtle movement of balance that none of them could ignore anymore. The riders remained where they were, but the certainty they had arrived with no longer sat as firmly in their posture, and Caleb stood there, unmoving, the paper still in his hand, the truth not yet revealed, but closer now, close enough that everyone present could feel it waiting just beneath the surface, ready to rise the moment someone chose to push it there. The silence did not break, it deepened, like the moment before a storm chooses whether to arrive or pass. The riders held their ground, their horses shifting slightly beneath them, restless but controlled, while the man in front kept his eyes fixed on the paper in Caleb's hand, not on the woman, not on the children, because something about that folded sheet had begun to outweigh everything else in the clearing. Caleb lifted it just enough now, not high, not dramatic, only enough for the seal to catch the light filtering through the branches, a dull shine, official, undeniable, the kind of mark that did not shout authority but carried it quietly into every room it entered. Eleanor felt it before she fully saw it, the subtle change in the air, the way the lead rider's posture shifted, the smallest hesitation where certainty had lived just moments before. And she understood then that whatever Caleb had chosen to carry with him was not meant for defense, but for something far more final, something that did not argue, did not plead, only existed as truth waiting to be acknowledged. You are a long way from town to be asking questions that have already been answered, Caleb said, his voice still calm, still even, but now there was something beneath it, not force, not anger, something steadier, something that did not need to rise in volume to be heard. The lead rider narrowed his eyes slightly, studying the seal, the edges of the paper, the way Caleb held it, and then, finally, slowly, he shifted in his saddle, not forward, not back, just enough to mark a change. Then maybe you should answer them, he said, though the edge had dulled, replaced by something more cautious, more aware. Caleb unfolded the paper then, the sound of it soft but clear, cutting through the quiet in a way no raised voice could have. The document opened to its full length, the lines of ink precise, the signatures placed with intention. And he did not read it aloud, did not recite what was already written. Instead, he stepped forward one more pace and held it where the rider could see, where the truth could speak for itself without translation, without interpretation. The man leaned slightly, his gaze scanning the lines, recognition settling slowly, not sudden, not dramatic, but certain. His jaw tightened once, then released, and in that small motion, the entire balance shifted, not with noise, not with movement, but with understanding. The road they claimed to manage, to clear, to control, was not theirs to decide. Not today, not anymore. Behind him, the other riders exchanged brief glances, not questioning, not challenging, simply adjusting to the new shape of the moment. Because even out here, far from offices and desks, the weight of a seal still carried, the authority of a name still mattered, and the man holding it knew exactly how to use it without ever raising his voice. Eleanor watched this unfold with a stillness that mirrored Caleb's own, her hands resting lightly on her children's shoulders, not gripping, not pulling them away, because for the first time since the road, there was nothing advancing toward them that needed to be escaped, only something receding, something losing ground without taking a single step. The lead rider straightened slowly, his eyes lifting from the paper back to Caleb, then briefly, almost reluctantly, toward Eleanor, and in that glance there was no apology, no regret. But there was something else, something quieter, the absence of certainty, the absence of the right he had assumed only moments before. Did not realize, he said. The words simple, stripped of their earlier confidence. Caleb folded the paper again, just as carefully as he had opened it, returning it to his coat without hurry, without emphasis, as if the act itself had already done what it needed to do. Most people do not, he replied, and that was all. The wind moved once more through the trees, carrying the sound of water and leaves together, and the riders began to shift, not abruptly, not as retreat, but as adjustment. Their purpose altered, their direction no longer pointed at the family before them. The lead man gave a small nod, not of respect, not of submission, simply acknowledgement, then turned his horse slightly, the others following without question, without delay, and just like that, the pressure that had filled the clearing began to lift, not gone entirely, but lighter, thinner, as if the moment itself had chosen to step back and let something else take its place. Caleb did not watch them leave for long, only enough to ensure the direction had truly changed. Then his gaze returned to Eleanor, not expecting thanks, not offering explanation, just meeting her eyes once more in the quiet that followed. And in that silence, something settled, not loud, not obvious, but real, like a line that had been drawn and crossed at the same time, leaving behind a space where the road no longer belonged to those who had claimed it, but to those who had endured it. The quiet that followed did not feel empty. It felt earned, like something had shifted beneath the surface of the land itself, unseen but undeniable. Eleanor exhaled slowly, not in relief, not yet, but in recognition that the moment had changed and she was still standing within it. Her children pressed close, their small bodies no longer braced for impact, only listening, waiting. The boy's eyes moving from the direction the riders had gone back to Caleb, searching for something he could not name, while the younger child simply held on to her mother, her grip softer now, no longer anchored in fear, but in something steadier, something beginning to resemble safety. Caleb stepped back then, not retreating, just restoring the space between them to what it had been before, as if the act of stepping forward had never been about control, only timing. He adjusted the edge of his coat where the paper rested, the motion habitual, almost invisible, then glanced once toward the road beyond the trees, measuring distance, direction, consequence, all in a single quiet look. They will not come back, he said finally, not as a promise, not as reassurance, just as fact delivered without weight. Eleanor studied him for a moment longer, her gaze sharper now, not guarded in the same way, but not open either, somewhere between understanding and caution. You knew they would. Listen, she said, and this time it was not a question. Caleb met her eyes, holding them without hesitation. I knew they would have to, he replied, and there was no pride in it, no satisfaction, only certainty, the kind that did not belong to a man proving something, but to a man who had already decided where he stood. The boy stepped forward then, just slightly, his curiosity pushing him past the edge of silence. That paper, he began, then stopped, unsure how to ask what he needed to understand. Caleb looked down at him, not impatient, not dismissive, simply waiting, giving the question room to form. It changed everything. The boy finished, and Caleb nodded once. "No," he said quietly. It showed what was already true. The words settled into the space between them, simple, unadorned, but carrying a weight that stretched beyond the moment. Eleanor felt it too. The difference between creating power and revealing it, between force and fact, and something in her expression, shifted again, not trust, not gratitude, but recognition of a line she had not seen before. The wind moved through the leaves above, softer now, the edge of tension worn down by what had passed, and for the first time since the road, the land did not feel like it was watching them, judging them. It simply existed, open, waiting. Eleanor glanced toward the path ahead, the direction of Red Hollow, her jaw tightening slightly as if bracing for something that had not yet arrived. "That town," she said slowly. "It does not forget people like us." Caleb followed her gaze, his expression unchanged. "Then it is time it learned something new," he replied, the words quiet, almost lost in the movement of the trees, but they carried a steadiness that did not need to rise to be heard. The boy looked between them, then down at the ground where their footprints crossed and overlapped, 3 lines becoming 4 for a brief stretch. Before separating again, he did not speak, but something in his posture shifted, a small straightening, a subtle claim to the space beneath his feet that had not been there before. Caleb turned slightly then, gesturing toward the path that would lead them back to the road. "We should move before the sun gets higher," he said, practical, grounded, as if the moment behind them required no further attention. Eleanor nodded once, not in agreement alone, but in acceptance of what came next. She adjusted the bundle in her hands, her fingers brushing briefly against the place where the badge had once been hidden, then guided her children forward, her steps steady, deliberate, no longer shaped by the fear of being driven off, but by the choice to continue. Caleb walked with them, not ahead, not behind, his presence once again quiet, measured, as if the role he had stepped into earlier had already been set aside, replaced by something simpler, something more enduring. The road waited beyond the trees, unchanged in its dust and distance, but not the same as before, not for them, not anymore. And as they stepped back onto it together, there was no sound of snapping wood this time, no laughter carried on the wind, only the soft rhythm of footsteps moving forward, each one placed with a certainty that had not existed when the day began. The road stretched ahead in a long, pale line, unchanged in shape, yet altered in meaning. And as they walked, the silence no longer pressed against them, it moved with them, lighter now, like something that had decided not to follow too closely. Eleanor kept her pace steady, neither hurried nor slow, each step placed with intention rather than necessity, her children matching her rhythm without being told, the boy no longer looking back, the girl no longer clutching quite as tightly. Small changes, almost invisible, but real, and Caleb walked beside them as he had before, present without imposing, his gaze occasionally lifting to the horizon, not searching for danger, but measuring what lay ahead, the distance to Red Hollow shrinking with every step. The town appeared gradually, first as shapes against the brightness, then as structures, wood and dust and shadow forming something solid, something waiting. The wind carried the faint sounds of it before they reached the edge, a hammer striking somewhere, the murmur of voices, the low creak of a sign shifting above a doorway, ordinary sounds, but beneath them there was something else, something quieter, the memory of how the town had chosen to look away earlier that day. Eleanor saw it too, the familiar outline of a place that did not welcome questions. Her shoulders straightened slightly, not in defiance, not in fear, but in readiness, the kind that came from knowing what waited and choosing to walk into it anyway. The boy slowed for a moment, his eyes scanning the buildings, the people beginning to notice them, faces turning, not with surprise, but with recognition, whispers forming before words could follow, and the younger child pressed closer again, not from panic, but from awareness that this place carried its own kind of weight. Caleb did not change his pace, did not move ahead to announce their arrival. He simply walked with them into the edge of the town, letting the moment unfold without interruption. The first man they passed glanced at Eleanor, then at the children. then quickly away, his silence louder than any greeting. A woman near the well paused in her work, watching just long enough to confirm what she thought she saw before lowering her gaze, and the space around them shifted, not empty, but carefully avoided, as if their presence had already begun to press against something the town preferred to keep undisturbed. Eleanor stopped near the center of the street, not dramatically, not to draw attention, simply because there was nowhere else to go. Her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture unchanged, but her presence now undeniable. The children stood beside her, close but not hidden, their small forms steady in a way that did not match their age. And Caleb came to a stop as well, just off her shoulder, not leading, not stepping back, simply there. The murmur grew slightly, not louder, but more focused, a shifting of attention that spread from one person to the next, until the quiet became something shared, something waiting. And then a figure stepped forward from the doorway of a larger building, well-dressed, confident, the kind of man who carried authority not by law, but by habit. His eyes moved over Eleanor first, then the children, then finally to Caleb, and in that final glance, something changed, a flicker of recognition, quickly hidden but not gone. "You are a long way from where you should be," the man said, his voice smooth, practiced, meant to sound like reason rather than command. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "We are exactly where the road brought us," she replied, her tone quiet, but steady enough to carry. The man's smile tightened slightly, not enough to show displeasure, just enough to reveal it. His attention shifting again to Caleb, as if recalculating the moment, as if realizing that what stood before him was not as simple as it had first appeared. Caleb said nothing at first, his eyes resting on the man with the same calm presence he had held all day, not challenging, not yielding, simply present. And in that stillness, something began to shift again, slower this time, deeper, not a confrontation, not yet, but the beginning of one, shaped not by raised voices or sudden movement, but by the quiet understanding that the balance of the town had just been disturbed in a way that could not be easily restored. And as the wind moved through the street, carrying dust between them, it felt as though the entire place had paused, waiting to see which truth would be allowed to stand when the silence finally broke. The silence did not shatter, it settled, deeper than before, like dust finding its place after a long ride. And in that quiet, the man in the doorway shifted his weight, just enough to reveal that he understood something had changed, though he had not yet decided how to respond to it. His eyes lingered on Caleb a moment longer, searching for the shape of authority, the edge of threat, something he could measure, something he could push against. But what he found instead was stillness, the kind that did not invite conflict yet did not step aside from it either. And that unsettled him more than any raised voice could have. Eleanor remained where she stood, her presence steady, her children beside her like roots holding to ground that had not always been theirs. And for the first time since they had entered the town, she did not feel like she was standing at its edge. She stood within it, not as a visitor, not as someone passing through, but as someone who had a place whether the town accepted it or not. The man's smile returned, thinner now, more careful. "This town has its ways," he said, his voice still smooth, but the certainty within it no longer sat as firmly as before. Caleb inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the words without accepting them. "Every place does," he replied, his tone even, unhurried, as if there was no need to rush toward the point that was already approaching on its own. The man's gaze flicked once more toward the people gathering at a distance, the eyes watching, the ears waiting, and he understood then that this was no longer a private moment. Whatever he chose to do would be seen, remembered, carried beyond this street. He stepped forward slowly, boots pressing into the dust with deliberate weight, closing the distance just enough to stand opposite Eleanor, not close enough to intimidate, not far enough to ignore. His eyes met hers again, searching for weakness, for hesitation, but finding neither, only a quiet endurance that did not ask permission to remain, and that unsettled him in a way he could not easily hide. Caleb moved then, not stepping between them, not claiming space, but drawing just enough attention to himself to shift the balance once more. His hand rose, not abruptly, not dramatically, simply lifting the edge of his coat where the folded paper rested beneath. And though he did not take it out this time, the suggestion of it was enough. The memory of what it had already done still present in the air. The man's eyes followed the motion, recognition settling again, heavier now, less avoidable, and with it came something else, calculation turning into restraint. "If there is a question," Caleb said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for those nearby to hear, "it should be asked where it can be answered properly." The words were simple, but they shifted the ground beneath the moment, moving it from the street to something larger, something formal, something the man could not easily control, the suggestion of law without the need to name it, the suggestion of consequence without the need to threaten it. The man hesitated, just a fraction, but it was enough, enough for those watching to see, enough for the balance to tilt further. His gaze moved once more over Eleanor and her children, then back to Caleb, and in that movement, something settled, not agreement, not acceptance, but recognition that this moment was no longer his to shape alone. "Perhaps," he said finally, the word chosen carefully, stripped of its earlier authority, and he stepped back, not retreating, but yielding space in a way that could not be mistaken. The crowd did not react, not openly, but the silence changed again, less tense now, more certain, as if something unspoken had been decided without the need for declaration. Eleanor felt it, the subtle shift that told her she was no longer standing against the town, but within it, even if only for this moment, even if only because someone had chosen to stand where others had not. Caleb lowered his hand, the gesture complete without ever revealing the paper again, and his gaze moved briefly to Eleanor, not seeking acknowledgement, not expecting gratitude, just confirming that the line they had crossed could not be undone. And then he looked away, toward the street ahead, as if the path forward mattered more than the moment behind. And in that quiet turning, the story did not end. It simply moved, carried forward by footsteps that no longer hesitated, by a presence that no longer needed permission, and by a truth that had found its place without a single shot fired. The town did not return to what it had been, not completely, not after a line had been drawn so quietly that no one could point to the exact moment it appeared, yet everyone felt where it lay. Eleanor stood a second longer than necessary, as if allowing the ground beneath her to settle into this new shape. Then she moved, not away, not retreating, but forward, guiding her children with a hand that no longer carried the same weight as before. The boy walked straighter now, his steps more certain, the girl's grip softer, her eyes lifting just enough to see the faces around them not as something to fear, but something to pass through. The people of Red Hollow watched, not openly, not with confrontation, but with a quiet awareness that had not been there that morning. Some lowered their gaze. Others held it a moment longer than before, and in those small choices, something shifted, not loudly, not completely, but enough to be noticed by those who understood how change truly began. Caleb did not follow immediately. He remained where he was for a breath longer, his eyes moving once across the street, across the doorways, across the faces that had chosen silence before and now found themselves standing in it differently, not absolved, not accused, just aware. And then he turned, stepping into motion without hurry, his boots finding the same dust that had carried the day from one moment to the next. He caught up beside Eleanor without announcement, without claiming place, simply there again, as he had been on the road, as he had been by the stream, as he had been when it mattered, his presence unchanged, steady, as if what had passed required no recognition beyond what it had already done. They walked together through the center of the town, not as strangers, not as allies, something quieter than both, something built not from words exchanged but from moments shared, from choices made when no one else moved. The boy glanced up at Caleb once, then again, as if trying to understand the kind of man who could change everything without raising his voice. But he did not ask, and Caleb did not explain, because some things did not belong in answers, they belonged in memory. At the far end of the street, where the buildings thinned and the road opened again into distance, Eleanor slowed, then stopped, turning slightly toward Caleb, not fully, not dramatically, just enough to meet his eyes one last time. The wind moved between them, carrying dust and sunlight together, and for a moment, neither spoke, because there was nothing left that needed to be said aloud. You saw, she said finally, her voice quiet, not thanking, not questioning, simply acknowledging. Caleb held her gaze, the same stillness in his expression, the same calm that had never asked for anything in return. I stayed, he answered, and in those two words, everything that had happened found its place, not as something owed, not as something given, but as something chosen. Eleanor nodded once, a small motion, but complete, then turned back to the road ahead, guiding her children forward again, their figures growing smaller with each step, not because they were leaving, but because they were continuing. And this time, the road did not push them aside. It opened, not wide, not welcoming, but enough. Caleb remained where he was, watching just long enough to see that they would keep going, that nothing behind them would reach forward to pull them back. Then he turned his horse, not toward the town, not toward the road they had come from, but toward a path that cut quietly along the edge of everything, a direction that did not ask to be followed. The wind moved once more across Red Hollow, lifting dust into the light before letting it fall again. And in that brief motion, the town held something new, not spoken, not declared, but understood. That justice out here did not always arrive with noise, did not always carry a weapon. Sometimes it rode in silence, saw what others ignored, and chose not to turn away. And long after the footsteps faded, long after the street returned to its brevuge quiet, there remained a memory that no one could quite shake, not of what was done, but of what was not. Because out here, on roads that forgot most things, the rare moments that stayed were never the loud ones. They were the quiet ones, the ones where a man could have walked away and did not. The road beyond Red Hollow did not promise anything, and perhaps that was why it felt more honest than the one behind them. Eleanor walked with the same steady rhythm, but something in her posture had shifted, not lighter, not easier, just more certain, as if each step now belonged to her in a way it had not before. The children followed close, their movements less guarded, the boy occasionally glancing ahead instead of down, the girl no longer watching every shadow as if it might reach for her. Small changes, quiet ones, but real. The town behind them began to blur into distance, its shapes softening under the sun, its voices fading into the wind. Yet what had happened there did not fade with it. It lingered, not as a memory of conflict, but as something more enduring, a moment when silence had chosen a different side, when one man had refused to let it remain empty. Caleb rode a short distance behind now, not leading, not guiding, his horse moving at an easy pace, hooves pressing gently into the dust. He did not call out, did not close the distance, because whatever needed to be said between them had already found its place, and what remained was not words, but understanding, the kind that traveled without sound. Eleanor slowed near a bend in the road where the land opened wider, the horizon stretching out in quiet lines of gold and shadow. She turned slightly, not fully facing him, but enough to acknowledge his presence without drawing it into something more. You do not have to follow, she said, her voice calm, not dismissing, not inviting, simply stating what she believed to be true. Caleb reined his horse in gently, stopping a few yards back, his gaze resting on her, not questioning, not correcting, just listening. I know, he answered after a moment. The words simple, unburdened, and yet they carried more than agreement. They carried choice. The boy looked between them, sensing something he could not fully understand, something that did not need explaining, while the girl watched her mother, waiting for the direction that would define what came next. Eleanor studied Caleb for a brief second longer, not searching for answers this time, but recognizing something in him that did not need to be proven again. Then she nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement, and turned back to the road, continuing forward without hesitation. Caleb remained where he was for a breath longer, the wind moving through the space between them, carrying dust and light together. Then he shifted slightly in the saddle, turning his horse not sharply, not decisively, but with the ease of a man who did not need to rush his decisions. His path angled away from theirs, not crossing, not following, just running alongside for a time before drifting into its own direction. The distance between them grew slowly, not as separation, but as something natural, something that did not erase what had been shared, only allowed it to settle into place. Eleanor did not look back again, not because she forgot, but because she did not need to. The proof of what had happened was not behind her. It was in the way she walked now, in the way her children walked beside her, in the quiet certainty that no longer needed to be questioned. The sun hung high above, casting long, steady light across the land, and the road continued, stretching forward without promise, without guarantee, but no longer with the same weight. Because somewhere between the dust and the silence, something had changed, not loudly, not visibly, but enough that a woman and her children could walk it without being pushed aside, enough that a man could choose to stay when leaving would have been easier, and enough that the kind of justice that did not announce itself could still be felt long after the moment had passed. The wind carried their footsteps forward, but it also carried something else, something quieter, something that stayed behind in the spaces they left, because not all moments traveled with the people who lived them. Some remained, settled into the dust, into the memory of a place that did not know how to forget once it had truly seen. Red Hollow stood as it always had, wood and shadow and habit, but beneath it, something had shifted, not enough to be named, not enough to be pointed at, yet. Enough that the next time a wagon rolled through, the next time someone stood at the edge of the road with nowhere else to go, the silence might hesitate before choosing its side. A man at the well lifted his head that afternoon, watching the road longer than he needed to, not searching for anyone in particular, just looking, as if expecting the shape of something different to appear, while a woman who had turned away earlier paused at her doorway, her hand resting against the frame, her gaze fixed on the stretch of dust where the tracks had once cut deep, her expression unreadable, but changed in a way she could not quite explain even to herself. The man from the doorway, the one who had spoken with certainty that morning, stood alone now, his posture unchanged, his clothes still clean, his presence still strong. Yet there was something missing, something that had slipped away without noise, without confrontation, something that could not be reclaimed by speaking louder or standing taller, because it had not been taken. It had simply been shown to be less than what he believed it was. He looked out over the street where the moment had unfolded, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, not in defeat, but in recognition that there were forces he could not command, not with wealth, not with habit, not with the quiet agreement of those around him. And that knowledge settled into him like dust, not heavy, not immediate, but persistent. Beyond the town, the road continued as it always did, stretching through open land that held no memory of names or faces, only of movement, of those who passed and those who stayed. And on that road, Eleanor Hayes walked with her children, her steps unbroken, her path unclaimed by anyone but herself. The boy carried the bundle a little higher now, not out of burden, but out of ownership, while the girl walked without looking over her shoulder, her small stride finding a rhythm that matched her mother's more with each passing mile. Caleb Whitaker rode alone along a separate line of land, his figure distant now, reduced to shape and motion against the horizon, and yet the weight of what he had chosen remained close, not as something he carried, but as something that had already been placed where it belonged. He did not look back, not because he forgot, but because the work of that moment had never been about what followed. It had been about what did not happen, about the choice to remain when leaving would have been easier, about the refusal to let silence remain empty. The sun began its slow descent, casting longer shadows across the land, stretching each figure, each movement into something larger than itself, and in that light, the world seemed quieter, not empty, not still, but balanced in a way that did not require noise to be understood. Somewhere between the town that had learned something it could not name and the road that had allowed a family to continue, there remained a truth that did not belong to any one person, not to the widow, not to the children, not even to the man who had chosen to stay. It belonged to the space between them, to the moment where nothing loud had happened, yet everything had changed, and out here, where the land did not remember words but did remember choices, that was enough. The night came slowly, not as a curtain falling, but as a quiet agreement between the sky and the land, the light fading in long, soft lines until everything that had been sharp became gentle. And on that road, far from the edges of Red Hollow, Eleanor Hayes stopped at last, not because she could not go further, but because she chose where to end the day, a small rise in the land where the wind moved freely and the horizon remained open. She set the bundle down with care, her children settling beside her without question, their movements no longer driven by urgency, but by the simple rhythm of rest. The boy gathered a few dry branches, his steps sure, his hands steady, while the girl sat close, her head leaning lightly against her mother's side, her eyes half closed, no longer watching for shadows that might move against them. Eleanor looked out over the stretch of land before them, the road now a quiet line in the fading light, and for a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. Without holding anything back, not fear, not expectation, just breath. Somewhere in the distance, a horse moved, slow, unhurried. Caleb Whitaker riding along the far edge of the land, his figure barely more than a silhouette now. And though he did not turn toward them, did not call out, there was no distance in what had been done, no separation in the choice that had already taken its place between their lives. It did not require presence to remain true. The fire the boy built caught slowly, a small flame at first, then stronger, its light flickering against their faces, soft, steady, the kind of light that did not push back the dark completely, but made it easier to sit within it. Eleanor watched the flame for a moment, then reached into the bundle, pulling out what little they had left, sharing it without words, without hesitation, the act simple, ordinary, yet carrying a quiet strength that had not been there before, because it was no longer shaped by loss, but by continuation. The boy glanced up at her once, as if asking something he could not yet form into words, and Eleanor met his eyes, not answering, but giving him something else instead, a look that held certainty, not about what would come, but about what they had already passed through, and in that, he nodded, small, almost imperceptible, but enough. The stars began to show, one by one, scattered across the sky in patterns older than any road, older than any town, and under that sky, the world felt vast, not empty, not lonely, but open in a way that did not demand anything from them, only allowed them to exist within it. Back in Red Hollow, the streets lay quieter than before, not because nothing had happened, but because something had, something that did not leave marks in the dust or echoes in the air, but settled deeper into the way people would look the next time, into the pause before someone chose to turn away, into the understanding that silence could carry weight when it chose to stand with something instead of against it. Caleb rode until the town was no longer visible, until even the memory of its edges faded into the night, and then he slowed, his horse easing into a stop. He sat there for a moment, looking out over the same stretch of land that now held a small fire in the distance, barely visible, yet present, and though he did not move toward it, did not approach. There was no distance in what mattered, because the work of that day had never been about staying close. It had been about not leaving when it counted. He turned his horse at last, not toward the past, not toward the place where everything had begun, but toward whatever lay ahead, the path unmarked, the direction unclaimed, and he rode on, the sound of hooves soft against the earth, fading into the same quiet that had carried the story from its first moment to its last. And out there, beneath a sky that did not judge and a land that did not remember names, only choices, something remained, not spoken, not written, but understood, that justice, when it came without noise, without force, without the need to prove itself, did not fade. It settled, like dust in still air, like light at the edge of evening, like a man who saw what others ignored and chose, in the simplest way possible, not to turn away.